Okay, so before we talk about the shoulder joint, I had that next in your presentation for moving around, learning the muscle attachments and innervations. I think this is an appropriate time to go ahead and define what we mean by joints. So it's pretty simple. I won't spend a lot of time with it. There's a little new terminology here for you. We can categorize joints into three general groupings in the human body: fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial. Now, some of these we've seen already because we couldn't help ourselves as we were learning about hyaline cartilage and fibrocartilage, and as we've learned about the skull, we've seen some of these. As I've mentioned, the upper and lower jaw bones, we talked about them. So some of this is just review. Ultimately, what I want to do here is just get terminology done with you. So what does it mean to say a syndesmotic joint or a synchondrosis? So terminology, locations of these, and just an example of each just very quickly. And then we want to spend most of our time here. So I'm going to give you a synovial joint, a picture of a synovial joint, a knee as a model. We talk about the things we expect to find there. And then as we go to each of the joints, we'll expect to find these characteristic pieces and parts that I'll list for you here today in talking about the synovial joints. All right, so let's do them one at a time. Fibrous joints, we say, are connected by fibrous connective tissues. Every time I see fibrous connective tissues associated with bones, I think skull. It's the first thing that comes to my mind. Intramembranous ossification. So here, the first type of fibrous joint mentioned in your text is an immovable joint. These are sutural joints. Now, we know better than that, don't we? If I say that a sutural joint is immovable, what have I just said? I'm talking about an adult skull, because the fibrous connective tissues allow some mobility here, right, in the fetal skull. So with the fontanelles and the sutural joints, there are soft tissues until the skull has completed its ossification, normally by the time you're about 3 years old. Okay. Some of these joints are slightly movable. A syndesmotic joint or a syndesmosis joint is like the joint between the tibia and the fibula, or the radius and ulna. All right, so these only exist in two places, in the arms and legs. And so there is, in fact, between the tibia, between the radius and the ulna in your arm, a dense fibrous sheet of connective tissue holding those two bones together. It actually serves to help create compartments in your arm, and it serves as a highway, if you will, for the traversing of very important nerves and blood vessels. And we call them the names. We call the ends of these nerves by the names of those fibrous connective tissues. They are called, in the arms and legs, the interosseous membranes. And so I'm going to show you a picture of that in just a moment. The interosseous membranes of the syndesmotic joints of the tibia, fibula, and radius ulna. And then gomphosis are also considered to be fibrous connective tissue joints. These are the dentoalveolar joints, where the teeth are sitting in the alveolar pockets within our maxilla and mandible bones. All right, the second group are the cartilaginous, and these guys obviously are made of cartilage, and it can be fibro or hyaline. Now, you've seen these. We'll show you pictures of them again today, but you've seen these guys already. A symphysis joint. A symphysis joint. Where have I seen that? Fibrocartilage between the vertebral bones and fibrocartilage between the pubic bones. A symphysis joint. Or immovable. These immovable joints are the synchondrosis joints of the epiphyseal plates and the costal cartilages. Now let's think about this for a second, because we've seen this already too. If I say that an epiphyseal plate is an immovable joint, what did I just say about that bone? Same thing I said about the skull, right? So you're not going to move it around after the cartilage is gone. So in terms of thinking about progression here, the first thing that came to my mind is endochondral ossification. The secondary ossification centers are made of hyaline cartilage. And here's where the name comes from. See it? Chondro for cartilage, synchondrosis here in the epiphyseal plates, where the primary and secondary ossification centers are chasing each other down. Primary. is chasing down the secondary, we should say. Okay, and then the costal cartilages. These are the joints between the ribs and the sternum. We talk about these, right? The first 7 we call true ribs because they have a costal cartilage, a cartilaginous joint directly to the sternum. The next 3, 8, 9, and 10, also attached to the sternum indirectly by the 7th rib, costal cartilage. And then 11 and 12 does not have a hyaline cartilage joint. So these costal cartilages are the costal cartilages of the ribs and their attachment to the sternum. And then the last one here, these movable joints that we all think about when we say joints, the synovial joints and their characteristics. Now let's look at some pictures, and then let's talk a little bit about what you mean with some of this joint terminology in reference to synovial joints. I got pictures, here we go. So, first, the sutural joint. An adult skull, right? The fibrous connective tissue is gone. This is bone. That's a sutural joint. Immovable. Fibrous connective tissue, sutural joints. There is the interosseous membrane, the interosseous ligament here between the radius and the ulna. So you can see these two bones are not just laying there between muscles. They are actually connected to one another by a dense fibrous piece of connective tissue. The interosseous membrane holds these things together. Here's a gomphosis, the articulation of the tooth and the mandible and or the maxilla. Now, as the semester wears on your last test section, I'm going to show you this picture again, and then we're going to detail the parts of this so that you know all the little nuances of a tooth hanging on inside a jawbone. These are the symphysis joints, the fibrocartilage pads between the bones of the vertebral column and the fibrocartilage between the bones of the hip. The pubic bones articulated here with fibrocartilage. Now this is a synovial joint, a knee, an example here, and we're going to do this. We'll probably get to this on Friday if time serves us well. This is a knee joint here, and what you can see here are, this is a picture intended to teach you the components of any given synovial joint. So it's color-coded here to help me remember the various parts that you would expect to see in any synovial joint. And those things would include, we'll start up here on the top right, they would include a synovial membrane. So you can see the red here is a soft tissue membrane that lines what we would call the joint cavity. This synovial membrane is accurately colored red here because it is a highly vascularized membrane, and it is in part leaking. I shouldn't say leaking as if that's a problem, but the joint cavity itself will have fluid in it, a lubricating fluid that originates with plasma. And so the vascularization of these synovial membranes helps the synovial joint cavity remain moist. There should be liquid inside this joint cavity so that the cavity can slide and move about freely. What it also points out to you, the synovial membrane points out here, is that there is in fact a house here, a closed house. So the synovial membrane helps to create this closed house. And so if, for example, you do damage to your knee, you don't typically find the crural region of your leg or your ankle swelling. Your knee swells. And that is because this closed house keeps the fluid in-house. It's also a useful clinical place. You can tell things about what's going on in the knee by getting you a sample of this fluid. So if somebody has a swollen knee, and you stick a needle in there and you take a sample of that fluid, the contents of that synovial fluid will tell you something about what's going on here. For example, a person with some kind of osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, the degeneration of the ends of the bones here, an autoimmune situation, that causes the bones to rub together. You're going to expect the swollen knee there to have blood cells in it because the bone itself is deteriorating. So you can tell things clinically about the knee joint because of this cavity. You can get a sample of fluid there. All right, so the synovial membrane helps to create the house that the joint is operating in, and it helps to lubricate that joint. It is a vascularized membrane. There is a joint cavity. So with all these synovial joints, you have a cavity. So there's a capsule there and a cavity inside it, in the shoulders and the jaws and in the hands, around the carpals and metacarpals and in your phalanges and between the radius and the ulna. All these synovial movable joints in your body have these synovial membranes and these joint cavities. And of course they have different shapes and stuff. But these are characteristics, all right? Here's another characteristic so a membrane, a cavity. Another characteristic is you expect to find within a synovial joint hyaline cartilage pieces on the ends of the bones that are articulating. So, you know this, the vast majority of bones in your body are made from hyaline cartilage models. And so the ends of those bones never lose the hyaline cartilage that was used to build it to start with. So after the secondary ossification center has finished, and you have an epiphyseal plate here now, where there is no cartilage, you still have a piece of hyaline cartilage, we called it articular, on the end of the bone. So even if you are to remove anything between bones, like in your knee, for example, there are pieces of fibrocartilage within the knee. We call them menisci, or singular meniscus. Even if you were to remove those pads, you would still have cartilage acting on cartilage. So this is a characteristic of a synovial joint. You expect to see this wherever you go in these movable joints. All right. Synovial membrane, joint cavity, articular cartilage, and synovial fluid. All right, last thing for characteristics is most, not all, but most movable joints in your body have bursa associated with them. Now a bursa, you can see here, there are several of them labeled around this knee joint. I love the names of them. There's about a dozen, 12 or 13, depending on which book you look at, named bursa in the knee joint. And I love the names here because I never require students to memorize them because you can make them up, right? You just guess where a bursa would be. You would guess the bursa would be in one of two locations. The bursa will be between the bone and the outside world to act as a cushion, or between bones and muscles to cushion articulations. So you can see that here. The knee's a great example of this. This one's called the subcutaneous prepatellar bursa. Subcutaneous tells you it's just under the skin, right? And it's prepatellar. It is in front of the patella. So it's named for where it's located. Now, what would be the purpose of that thing? To create a little bag, a little cushion bag on the front of your patella. So you can actually feel this. I'm sure after class you guys will be poking around on your knees. You can actually feel that little soft piece on the front of your patella there. It's intended to protect that little sesamoid bone. All right, here's another one right here. This one is called the subcutaneous infrapatellar bursa. So this one is just under the skin. And then notice here I have a ligament, the patellar ligament. And then this ligament has just deep to it an infrapatellar bursa. So let's see if this fits in our categories. What would be the purpose of the subcutaneous infrapatellar bursa? Okay, so this is the front. So I'm looking at this from a sagittal or lateral view. This is the anterior and that's the posterior of my knee. Okay, so what would be the purpose of this bursa right here? Well, this is the front of your tibia. And you guys know that that bone has a bony projection. There's a tibial tuberosity that actually fuses all the way up to the proximal side of the tibia. There's a knot a knot that extends all the way up on the anterior side of the tibia. And as it turns out, you have a bursa right on the front of that to help cushion that knot. So first category was protect things from the outside world. And so these two fit that category quite nicely. This one fits in the second category nicely, which is the category of protecting the articulations. So in many cases, these guys sit where tendons or ligaments would tend to rub against the bones. You don't want things rubbing on bones, because if you rub on a bone, the bone will respond to that by making more bone. This is normally the problem in a shoulder. Whenever you rub the rotator cuff on the bone surface itself, some damage you've done there, you begin to get a bone spur, and it's not going away. It's going to get worse and worse till you have to do surgery. And so you can see the importance of this bursa right here, this little bag of synovial fluid right here. This one sits deep to the patellar ligament. Now, you don't know this yet, at least not from me, but all four muscles of the quadricep, all of these big four here, the vastus lateralis and the vastus medialis and the vastus intermedius and the rectus femoris, all these huge muscles on the front of your leg right here, all share an attachment on the tibial tuberosity. They cross over the patella, you can see here, these guys cross over the patella to articulate with the patellar ligament at the tibial tuberosity. So whenever you do extension at the knee, all four of these muscles are pulling on the tibial tuberosity in order to do that. Now, that articulation right there has the potential, as you can see, to rub against the proximal side of the tibia, which we don't want happening. And so, isn't it interesting where that bursa is? It is sitting there to protect the articulation. So, you don't need to memorize the names of the bursa for me. You need to know what they do. And you could guess. I wouldn't ask you something that would be, tricking you on these. Now, I want to show you a couple of names on the shoulder, just so you can. A lot of people complain about bursitis in their shoulder, and I'd like for you to have a couple of those in mind. But normally you can make them up. Even in the shoulder, they're named for where they are. The subdeltoid bursa. Now, where would that be? If I had this big muscle comes across here and articulates on the deltoid tuberosity, and it's responsible for doing this, abducting my arm, it's going to have a tendency to rub on the proximal end of the humerus. We can't allow that to happen, and so what do you want to do? Put a bursa underneath it, and we call it the subdeltoid bursa. Okay, so bursa, we'll learn some of them in the shoulder. All right, so there's the general characteristics of movable joints: a membrane and a cavity, and articular and bursa, articular cartilage and bursa. All right, here's an example from back in the skull of a beautiful synovial joint. This one causes all kinds of problems for individuals. People say, I've got TMJ, to which I respond, thank goodness, because you would look funny if you didn't. What they really mean is, I have a problem with my temporomandibular joint, right? So I've corrupted you once again. You're going to meet people in your lives who will say to you, I have TMJ, and your first response is going to be snarky sarcasm. And I do not apologize for that. You're becoming educated, right? If you didn't have TMJ, you would not have a mandibular condyle articulating in the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. That would look bad. What you really meant to say was, I have a problem with this joint. What kind of problems would we expect? All right, well, let's see how it's held together. So I've got them numbered here, the three primary ligaments that actually hold this joint together. And they're named for their attachments. So the big daddy here is the lateral ligament of the temporomandibular joint. It's covered by the parotid. So in our dissection before, we got down to this, and I just didn't name them for you. So we pulled the skin off, and then we had the masseter, and we saw the parotid gland crossing the masseter, where the parotid duct emptied at the level of the second molar. Remember that? And now the parotid's been taken off, and now we're all the way down to the bone, and you can see this lateral ligament of the temporomandibular joint here. It articulates, it holds from the mandibular condyle to the zygomatic arch. From the zygomatic arch of the temporal bone to the mandibular condyle. This guy holds the joint together. Now there are two others that contribute. They're not as important, but they contribute, and this one is the one that attaches to the styloid process in the mandible. So you can see that articulation there. And the third one attaches to the sphenoid bone, and so hence the name sphenomandibular. Now you can see on this picture something that I always point out to you. This thing looks a lighter color than this does. And the reason for that, remember, that ligament is on the other side of that bone. So the sphenomandibular ligament, in order for it to get to the lateral side of the mandible, it would have to come across it. It would have to come across the top of it. You know where the lateral and medial pterygoid processes are of the sphenoid bone, right? They're medial on that bone. You turn the skull over and they're on the inside, right? That's where we put the lateral medial pterygoid muscles of mastication. Remember those? Okay, so this ligament is attached there, and then it attaches to the mandible from the sphenoid. So which direction does the sphenomandibular ligament run? Does it run straight up and down? No, which way does it go? Yeah, it's angled. Yeah, you can't really see that in this two-dimensional image. From the sphenoid over to the mandible, the sphenomandibular ligament. Those are the big three, the big one here. Now the other thing this picture labels for you is the joint capsule. Now, this has been many days since we looked at this, but when we did tissues together, and we got to ligaments, I showed you a picture of dense regular connective tissue, and I said, this is what tendon and ligament looks like under a microscope. Remember that? The regular arrangement of collagen. The next picture on the presentation was a picture of dermis, and it showed you the collagen was arranged irregularly, and we called it dense irregular because of the arrangement of the collagen. Vaguely remember that? Now, these two in this image look identical, do they not? Could you say, by looking at this, that the lateral ligament is not part of the joint capsule? Why does the text, why does everybody who shows a picture of this joint make a distinction between the joint capsule and the lateral ligament of the joint, when they're clearly fused tissue together? Why would you do that? Because of the histologist, that's why. Because if you section this connector right here, y'all, this joint capsule also connects to the zygomatic arch and the mandibular condyle. So why don't we just call the whole thing the lateral ligament? And the reason is the histologist. Because if you section this piece of tissue right here, it's dense regular. If you section this piece right here, it's dense irregular. They're different tissues. And so we call these dense irregular pieces of what we call the joint capsule, forming the house. So if you looked on the interior of this joint capsule, what would you find? If we looked on the other side of it, there would be a house there, right? A joint cavity. And that joint cavity would be lined by a synovial membrane. And it would have some fluid in it. And there'd be some cartilage in there. Let's have a look. Take it off. This is what it looks like on the inside. You see my articular cartilage here? You see my joint cavity here? Now, what's special about this joint cavity is the temporomandibular joint cavity is actually a dual cavity. There's actually an articular disc, a piece of cartilage that sits in the center of this cavity. Now, let's don't pretend like this is some kind of weird phenomenon, like the body doesn't do this anywhere else. In fact, we're going to see it again in just a few minutes. The shoulder is this way. There's a piece of cartilage in there between the bones. The knees do this. There's a piece of cartilage in there between the bones. We call them in the knee, we call them the meniscus. Okay, so there's an articular disc here in the joint cavity creating two cavities. Notice the disc extends all the way from anterior to posterior here through the joint. Now, this is what causes problems, y'all, in people's temporomandibular joints. The problem comes whenever this disc thins or is damaged to the extent so that the condylar surface articulates with the bone on the mandibular fossa. that's when you've got a situation. And so what would cause that to happen? Well, you've got to ram that condyle up into that disc and hold it and grind it, yes? So when you hear somebody has a problem with their joint because they're grinding their teeth like that, the problem is not with the grinding of the teeth. The problem is with the grinding of the mandibular condyle inside this joint cavity. Now, the problem is exacerbated, and I'll just tell you this and then we'll move on. The problem is exacerbated because this looks like a true hinge. A true hinge would be like the trochlea of the ulna on the trochlea of the humerus. That is a true hinge. It is just like the hinge of a door. This one looks like it, but it is not. In fact, because of the way the muscles attach to this thing, it actually, before the bottom jaw hinges down, this part of the bone, the condyle, moves anterior. So instead of being a true hinge joint, the joint does this. It moves forward and down. So forward and down, forward and down. And so every time we open our jaw, you are rubbing this condylar surface on that articular disc. And some people are prone to more problems with this than others. But you can see the anatomy of it and how that could potentially create problems there. All right, let's define the joints and do some actions for you. Gliding motions for joints, students don't normally have a problem with, like the interactions between the carpals and the tarsals and the wrists and the ankles, or between the flat articular process of the vertebral bones, so where that fibrocartilage is. And we talked a little bit about the articular facets and how it prevents that in the lumbar areas. Not much of that movement going on. Gliding movement doesn't, everybody can see that. It has the potential to glide as a flat surface. I got it. These don't normally cause a lot of problems, although I'm going to emphasize this one because it doesn't make sense with the names.